There's a conversation happening that most people never hear. A brutal, devastating conversation between the divine and certain souls. Not a gentle whisper of guidance, not a comforting message of love, but a harsh, unrelenting test delivered through the language of addiction, compulsion, and self-destruction. And Francis Bacon, in his deepest philosophical writings, suggested something that religious institutions refuse to acknowledge, that sometimes addiction is not weakness. Sometimes it's selection. Sometimes God speaks to his chosen ones through the very thing that's destroying them. This is not comfortable theology. This is not the sanitized spirituality you hear in churches or recovery meetings. This is the dark metaphysics of suffering. The brutal truth that some souls are tested in ways others never will be. That some people are chosen for greatness precisely because they can survive what would annihilate ordinary consciousness. That addiction, for certain individuals, is not a deviation from their path, but the path itself. The fire through which they must walk to become who they're meant to be. Bacon understood this because he lived it. Not addiction to substances necessarily, but addiction to knowledge, to power, to ambition, to the pursuit of understanding at any cost. He watched himself and others become consumed by singular obsessions that destroyed them even as they elevated them. And he recognized something profound in this pattern, that the same force that destroys is sometimes the force that creates, that God doesn't speak to everyone the same way, and for some the only voice loud enough to penetrate their consciousness is the voice of destruction. Let's talk about the philosophy of divine selection through suffering. Most religious traditions teach that suffering is punishment, that addiction is sin, that falling into compulsion means you've failed God or yourself or both. But Bacon saw deeper. He recognized that suffering, especially intense, prolonged, seemingly purposeless suffering, is sometimes how the divine selects and shapes souls capable of extraordinary things. Think about the pattern. The artists, writers, musicians, leaders, visionaries who've changed the world. How many of them descended into addiction? How many fought demons of compulsion and self-destruction? It's not a coincidence. It's not just that creative people tend toward addiction. It's that certain souls meant for something beyond ordinary existence, are tested through fire that would destroy lesser beings. Why? Because greatness requires understanding that can't be taught. It requires perspective that can't be given. It requires strength that can only be forged through survival of what should have killed you. You cannot understand the depth of human suffering without experiencing it. You cannot lead broken people without having been broken yourself. You cannot create art that speaks to souls in darkness without having dwelt in that darkness yourself. Bacon observed that the most profound insights came from those who'd suffered most deeply, not because suffering is inherently enlightening, but because surviving suffering creates something in the human soul that nothing else can create. A depth, a gravitas, an authenticity, a connection to reality unmediated by comfortable illusions. And for certain souls meant to see deeper and speak truer than ordinary people, this suffering is delivered through addiction. Now here's where it gets disturbing. For some people, addiction is the only language loud enough to get their attention. They're so strong, so stubborn, so convinced of their own capability that nothing less than complete destruction can reach them. God can't speak to them through gentle signs or subtle guidance. Those signals are too quiet, too easy to ignore, too compatible with continuing on their current path. So God speaks through addiction, through the progressive loss of control, through the humiliation of powerlessness, through the destruction of everything they thought they were, through the stripping away of ego, of pride, of the comfortable self-image that was keeping them from their actual purpose. This is not gentle. This is not kind. But it's effective in ways that gentleness never could be. Think about what addiction does to someone. It destroys their illusions of control. It reveals their powerlessness. It strips away their social masks. It forces them to confront the darkest parts of themselves. It brings them to a point where they either surrender completely or die. And that point, that moment of total surrender, that's when transformation becomes possible. That's when God can finally speak to them in a way they can actually hear. Bacon understood that some people are so invested in their own capability, their own strength, their own understanding, that nothing short of complete failure can humble them enough to receive what they need to receive. Addiction is the mechanism of that necessary failure. It's not punishment for being bad. It's preparation for being extraordinary. God is breaking them down to rebuild them stronger, destroying what they were to create what they need to become. Let me tell you about what Bacon called the test of fire. Not everyone who enters addiction is chosen. Most aren't. Most people who fall into addiction are simply experiencing the normal consequences of human weakness, circumstance, trauma, or poor choices. They're not receiving divine communication, they're just suffering. And that suffering may or may not lead anywhere meaningful, but some, a small percentage, are different. You can tell them by what happens next, by whether they survive, by what they become on the other side, by whether the suffering transforms them or just destroys them. The chosen ones don't just survive addiction. They emerge from it fundamentally changed, deeper, wiser, stronger in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength, more connected to truth, to reality, to purpose. Bacon saw this as a test. God tests souls meant for greatness through trials that would annihilate ordinary people. Not because God is cruel, but because greatness requires qualities that can only be forged in fire. You cannot develop certain capabilities without first being destroyed. You cannot access certain depths of understanding without first experiencing certain depths of suffering. The test is not whether you fall into addiction. The test is whether you survive it and what you become through surviving it. This is why recovery for the chosen ones is different from recovery for others. For most people, recovery is about returning to normal life, about becoming functional again, about managing a disease. But for the chosen ones, recovery is about transformation, about becoming something they never were before, about using the destruction as fuel for creation, about taking the pain and turning it into purpose. There's something mystics across traditions describe called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound spiritual desolation where God seems absent, where meaning disappears, where the soul experiences total abandonment. And Bacon recognized that addiction, for certain people, is a prolonged, dark night of the soul. It's not a biological disease alone. It's a spiritual crisis, a meeting with the divine through the language of destruction. During active addiction, the chosen ones are in hell. But they're not in hell because they're being punished. They're in hell because hell is where they need to be. Because only by experiencing complete darkness can they develop the capacity to carry light. Only by losing everything can they understand what actually matters. Only by facing their own capacity for destruction can they access their capacity for creation. This is terrifying theology. It means that God sometimes leads souls into darkness deliberately, not to harm them, but to prepare them, not to punish them, but to forge them. The suffering is not accidental. It's intentional. It's necessary. It's part of the divine plan for that particular soul. And while they're in it, while they're suffering, they can't see this. It looks like abandonment. It feels like punishment. It seems like meaningless destruction. But for the chosen ones, it's actually divine communication. God is speaking through the suffering, saying, "You are being prepared for something you cannot yet understand." Now let's talk about why God would choose this method. Why not use gentler methods? Bacon would say, because gentle methods don't work on the souls who need this particular lesson. These are strong souls, stubborn souls, souls that won't break easily, souls that won't surrender their ego without being forced. And God needs them broken, needs them humbled, needs them emptied of their own certainty so they can be filled with divine purpose. Think about the characteristics of people who become addicts. They're often intelligent, strong-willed, capable. People who've been able to succeed through their own capability, who've learned to trust themselves, who've developed powerful egos. These are not weak people. These are strong people. And their strength is exactly what's keeping them from their purpose. Because their purpose requires surrender, requires admission of powerlessness, requires depending on something beyond themselves. And strong people don't do this willingly. So God uses addiction, uses it to break the strong will, to destroy the powerful ego, to force surrender that would never come voluntarily. It's brutal. It's harsh. It destroys many who enter it. But for those strong enough to survive, it creates something that couldn't be created any other way. A soul that's been to hell and back. A consciousness that's been completely dismantled and rebuilt. A person who's experienced powerlessness so completely that they'll never again rely solely on their own power. This is who God can use for extraordinary purposes. Not people who've never been broken, but people who've been shattered and reconstructed. Not people who've never fallen, but people who've fallen completely and learned to rise. Not people who've never faced darkness, but people who've dwelt in darkness and found light in the depths of it. And here's where Bacon makes the crucial distinction. Not everyone who experiences addiction is chosen. The experience of addiction alone doesn't make you special. What makes you chosen is survival, is transformation, is what you become through the fire. Many enter addiction, most are destroyed by it. Some survive but remain broken. But a very few, emerge transformed. Stronger in their brokenness than they ever were in their strength. And those few, they're the ones God was speaking to all along. The selection isn't in the falling, it's in the rising. God throws many souls into the fire. Most burn up. Some escape still smoldering. But a few are forged into something new, something harder, something capable of things they couldn't have done before. And those few discover that their addiction, their suffering, their destruction, it wasn't random. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Bacon would say you can identify the chosen ones by what they do after recovery. Do they just return to normal life? Or do they use their experience to do something extraordinary? Do they help others who are suffering? Do they create art that speaks to depths of human experience others can't reach? Do they lead with authenticity that only comes from having been completely broken? Do they speak truth that only someone who's lost everything can speak? The chosen ones don't just survive addiction. They transform it. They take the suffering and alchemize it into purpose. They use the destruction as the foundation for creation. They recognize that they didn't go through that hell for nothing. They went through it because they needed to, because God was preparing them for something they couldn't have done without that preparation. So what exactly is God saying through addiction to the chosen ones? What's the message embedded in the destruction? Bacon would identify several critical lessons that can only be learned through this particular form of suffering. First, you are not in control. This is the foundational lesson, the one that had to be learned before anything else could be learned. You, with all your capability and strength and intelligence, you are fundamentally powerless over certain things. This is humiliating, devastating, but necessary. Because until you accept powerlessness, you'll keep trying to control things that can't be controlled. And that trying will prevent you from accessing actual power, which comes not from control but from surrender. Second, you need something beyond yourself. Your own strength is insufficient. Your own understanding is incomplete. Your own will is not enough. This is terrifying for strong people. They've learned to depend on themselves, to trust their own capability. And addiction destroys that trust, forces them to seek help beyond themselves, to depend on something transcendent. Whether that's God or community or some form of higher power, the lesson is the same. You alone are not enough. Third, suffering has meaning. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The addiction, The destruction, the pain, it's not random. It's not meaningless. It's not just bad luck or bad choices. For the chosen ones, it's purposeful. It's a message. It's preparation. And recognizing this, understanding that your suffering serves a purpose beyond just hurting you, that realization changes everything. Fourth, you were broken, so you could be rebuilt stronger. The destruction wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The old you, the you that existed before addiction, that person had to die, had to be completely dismantled. So the new you, the you that you're meant to become, could be constructed from the ruins. You're not recovering what you lost. You're discovering what you're meant to be. But we need to talk about the ethics and dangers of this philosophy. Bacon would admit that, because it can be misused. It can become an excuse. God wanted me to be an addict can become justification for not seeking recovery. My suffering has meaning can become reason to stay in suffering. This philosophy is only useful if it leads to transformation. If it becomes reason to stay stuck, it's poison. The chosen ones don't use their divine selection as excuse. They use it as fuel. They don't glorify their addiction. They transmute it. They don't stay in suffering celebrating its meaning. They emerge from suffering having extracted its lesson. The philosophy is true only for those who survive and transform. For those who stay stuck, it's just comforting delusion. Bacon would also say, don't presume you're chosen. Don't assume your suffering is divine communication just because you want it to be meaningful. The proof is in the transformation. If you emerge from addiction and do something extraordinary with what you learned, then yes, perhaps you were chosen. Perhaps God was speaking to you. But if you just survive and return to ordinary life, that's fine too. Not everyone is chosen for extraordinary things. Most aren't. And that's not a judgment. It's just reality. The danger is spiritual narcissism. Believing you're special because you've suffered. Believing your pain makes you superior. Believing God has singled you out for attention. This is ego dressed in spiritual clothing. True chosen ones don't feel special. They feel responsible. They recognize that survival came with obligation, that they were spared for a purpose, that their transformation demands they do something meaningful with it. Now, for those who are genuinely chosen, who genuinely experience addiction as divine communication, the recovery process is different. It's not just about stopping the substance or behavior. It's about integrating the lesson, understanding the message, accepting the purpose that the suffering was preparing them for. This means asking difficult questions. What did this teach me that I couldn't have learned any other way? What capacity did this suffering create in me? What understanding did it give me access to? What can I now do that I couldn't do before? And critically, what am I meant to do with this? Bacon would say the chosen ones know deep down what they're meant to do with their transformation. It's not always clear immediately, but over time, as they integrate the experience, as they heal and grow stronger, a sense of purpose emerges, something they're meant to create, or teach, or lead, or heal. Something that requires exactly the depth and understanding and strength that their suffering created in them. And this is where the philosophy becomes practical. It's not just metaphysical speculation, it's guidance for living. If you've survived addiction, if you've been transformed by it, if you sense that it wasn't just random suffering but preparation for something, then your task is to discover what that something is and do it. The suffering without the purpose is just suffering. The suffering that births purpose is divine communication. Francis Bacon's entire philosophical project was about gaining knowledge through experience, through observation, through testing reality. And he recognized that some knowledge is only accessible through certain types of experience. The knowledge available to someone who's never suffered is limited. The knowledge available to someone who's suffered but not transformed is different. But the knowledge available to someone who's suffered, transformed, and emerged with purpose, that's knowledge that can change the world. Bacon himself pursued knowledge at tremendous personal cost. His obsessive drive destroyed relationships, damaged his health, cost him political position. But it also made him one of the most influential thinkers in human history. He revolutionized how humans approach understanding reality, and he couldn't have done that without the consuming obsession that destroyed aspects of his life while creating his legacy. He understood that the same force that destroys can be the force that creates. That addiction, obsession, compulsion, these aren't always deviations from purpose. Sometimes they are purpose. Sometimes God speaks through the consuming fire and says, "This is what I've chosen for you. Not comfort, not safety, not a normal life, but this burning, this destroying, this transformation. Because I need you to understand things others won't understand, to go places others won't go, to become what others can't become." So if you've experienced addiction, if you've been destroyed and somehow survived, if you've emerged different than you were, deeper, darker, but also strangely stronger, you have to ask yourself the question Bacon would ask: was this just random suffering? Just bad luck, bad choices, biological disease? Or was something more happening? Was there a conversation occurring beneath the destruction? A message embedded in the pain? A purpose hiding in the devastation? You don't have to answer immediately. The answer might take years to become clear. But the question matters. Because if it was just random suffering, you move on and try to forget. But if it was divine communication, if you were chosen and tested and transformed for a purpose, then moving on without understanding that purpose is a betrayal of everything you endured. Francis Bacon would tell you, pay attention to what the suffering taught you. Pay attention to who you became through surviving it. Pay attention to the capabilities and understanding that emerged from the destruction. Because that's the message. That's what God was saying through the addiction. Not the substance or the behavior, but the transformation that surviving it created in you. That's the communication. That's the selection. That's the divine conversation that most people never hear, but that you heard, whether you realized it at the time or not. Some people are chosen through blessing, through ease and comfort and success. They hear God through gentle guidance and positive circumstances. But others, certain souls stronger and darker and more capable of surviving what would destroy normal people, they're chosen through fire, through destruction, through addiction, through suffering so complete that it strips away everything false and leaves only what's real. If you're one of those people, if you've been through the fire and somehow survived, if you've emerged transformed by what should have destroyed you, then perhaps, just perhaps, God was speaking to you all along. Through the suffering, through the powerlessness, through the destruction, saying, I chose you for something that requires exactly what this experience is creating in you. Now survive, transform, and discover what I'm preparing you for. That's the dark philosophy Francis Bacon would recognize. That's the brutal metaphysics of addiction as divine selection. Not comfortable, not kind. But for those who survive it, possibly the most important truth they'll ever encounter. That their suffering wasn't meaningless. That their addiction wasn't just weakness. That God speaks to his chosen ones in many languages. And sometimes, for the strongest souls, the only language loud enough to reach them is the language of complete destruction. The question isn't whether this is true for everyone. It isn't. The question is whether it's true for you, and only you can answer that. Through your survival, through your transformation, through what you become and what you do with what the fire forged in you.